Hey, it's JP Morgan here. Today on the Slant Lens, we're going to talk about shutter. Shutter is a moving part of your camera, and so it freezes or it blurs moving objects that you photograph. Let's talk about how it does it, why it does it, and how to use it, how to control it, next here on the Slant Lens. So let's talk about shutter. I've got Jeremiah here with us. He juggles, which is perfect to look at shutter because it's movement. We're going to see how the shutter stops that movement or blurs that movement. The shutter is an electronic curtain in your camera that's just in front of the film sensor. That curtain opens and closes. You get to control the length of time that curtain opens and closes. Thus, you have control of the shutter speed. With a long shutter speed, the shutter opens and is open for a long time, which allows the scene to blur in front of the camera as the image is being captured. Thus, you create motion blur before the shutter closes. Short shutter speeds freeze the action because the shutter opens and closes so quickly that the action doesn't have time to change before the image is captured. Let's not forget that shutter speed is the amount of time that light strikes the sensor. It's part of the exposure triangle: shutter, aperture, and ISO. But today we're going to concentrate on how shutter speed controls motion. We'll understand more how to put these all together in equivalent exposure to last in this three-part series. So right now, let's concentrate on shutter, stopping, or creating motion. It's really important to remember that large numbers like 4,000 means really fast, and it's going to freeze motion. Short numbers like 1/30th or 1 second are long numbers, and it's going to blur motion. So 1/4000th will freeze, 1 second will blur. When would you want to use the shutter to create motion? When you're doing water, get that great kind of fluid looking water as you lengthen that shutter. Beautiful for landscapes. If you want a car to blur as it's going by, to look like it's having great speed and motion. If you want to be able to blur a person as they're going by, just give it interest, or the subway as it flies by, or a train. Great times you're going to want to let that shutter blur. When you're going to want to freeze action with your shutter, sports photography. Anytime you want to freeze the action or happen on a sporting field, a football field, a baseball field, a soccer field, any of the fields, you're going to want to use a very short shutter of 1/4000th of a second to be able to freeze that action. If somebody's jumping off from a step and you want to catch them in mid-motion, you're going to want to use a short shutter to freeze that action. So there's a lot of times you're going to want to freeze action. So let's clarify numbers. 1/4000th of a second is a very small number, and it freezes motion. As you go to 1/2000th of a second, it gets longer. That means it's going to not freeze motion as much. When you go to 1,000th of a second, that is becoming a longer exposure. The shutter is open for a longer amount of time. As you go to 500th, it's open longer. 200th, even longer. When you hit 100th, it's open completely and then closes. As you go to 60th, it's open for a moment and closes. Then when you go to a 30th of a second, it opens and waits and then closes. As you go to a second, it opens, 1/1000, then closes. There's a couple of things you need to help you control your shutter and unlock all of the capabilities of the shutter in your camera. Number one is a tripod. You've got to have something you can put your camera on, because after a 60th of a second, it starts to be too long. As you go to a 30th of a second, 15th of a second, a quarter of a second, as it gets to those longer shutter speeds, it's just too hard to handhold. The next thing you need is an ND filter. An ND filter, a neutral density filter, all it simply does is you put it in front of your lens and it cuts a stop of light away, or 2 stops of light away, or 3 stops of light away. And it doesn't change anything but just the amount of light that goes through your lens and hits your sensor. So with an ND filter, if I want a longer shutter speed, I can put a 6-stop neutral density in front of my lens, and it gets rid of 6 stops of exposure, which means I can lengthen my shutter longer and longer to be able to blur things. So in conclusion, remember that the shutter is a member of the exposure triangle. It also can freeze action, and last of all, it loves to blur action. Too many times people just use the shutter to get an exposure and don't think about the creative possibilities that the shutter allows them in their images. So use your shutter to unlock the creative capabilities of your camera. It can be amazing. Get that tripod, shoot some incredible things with your shutter. Make that happen. So keep those cameras rolling and keep on clicking.